We're delighted to have the Finance Minister, Mr. Jaitley, welcome, and you've had a very busy schedule today. Now, I'm going to encourage you, even if you haven't downloaded your app yet, to use that or the email address to get messages to me based on what you hear Mr. Jaitley say. It's a great way of knowing how many of you do want to ask questions. We have about 40 minutes. The Minister's got some remarks he wants to make at the beginning, but actually he said to me he'd rather like to hear what's on your mind. I should remind everybody that this is on the record, just so there's no doubt about that. And really this is a conversation among more than 400 of you, if that's possible. So, Minister, do you want to get going? I've already got one question here, which I will put to you in a moment, but would you like to start it with some thoughts? Given that the World Bank, and I checked on the website this afternoon, is still saying that India is in a soft spot, a sweet spot. It is doing well, but there are a number of significant challenges still ahead. Here you are 18 months into your new government. The floor is yours for a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you very much at the Singapore Summit, Your Excellency the Minister. And thank you, George, for having given me and India this opportunity to be one of the focuses of the Singapore Summit this year. Well, yes, Nick mentioned that we've been about 16, 17 months in government. And a government at a time where, obviously, the global growth is a little slow, and we had our obvious challenges. You've had turbulent times in the last few months, and there were a lot of legacy issues with India which we had to clear up. And therefore, decision-making had to be quick in India, decision-making had to be decisive. The direction of that decision-making had to be absolutely clear in India. We do believe that if India is to get out a very large number of its people and pull them out of poverty, a 6 to 8% growth rate is just not enough. And our principal challenge in India, therefore, is to graduate from that 6 to 8% growth rate into an 8 to 10% growth rate. And every step that we've been taking for the last 1.25 years in India is distinctively aimed in that direction. Now, obviously, India being a large democracy, we face our own challenges in decision-making, particularly when parliamentary decision-makings are involved. We have a comfortable majority in the lower house, not in the upper house, and therefore larger consensus building in the upper house is required. But at the same time, most of the decisions which we want to take, except some complicated decisions which involve a certain level of parliamentary majority, we have been able to take. And as a result of which, we'd have been happier with a much faster growth rate. We ended last year with a 7.3% growth rate. Hopefully this year, it could be a little better than that. And the basic parameters of the economy seem to be doing much better than they were earlier. And if you'd like me to elaborate the roadmap which we followed, we've opened out the Indian economy, most sectors up for investment. We were conscious of the fact that India did not have the reputation for being the easiest place to do business, and therefore we had to have several internal correctives in India. Much has been done. There is something still on the table in that direction. We inherited a large number of taxation issues as legacy issues. Many of them have been sorted out, only a few remain. We've tried to eliminate even the slightest allegation of corruption or its possibility in decision-making. People, by and large, have confidence in the current regime because they perceive it to be certainly an honest regime which is working without any collateral purposes. And a case in point was allocation of natural resources, which had led to huge controversy in the last 1 decade. We have been taking steps to correct our banking system. We've launched a very large social security program which is making the Indian economy far more inclusive. We've rationalized a lot of subsidies in public expenditure. The current commodity and oil pricing regime globally has helped us. We've saved a lot. We've linked many of those prices directly to the market by deregulating petroleum. And the extent of savings which we've been able to make in the current system, we've been able to divert a large part of our resource on infrastructure creation, as also on irrigation. And I do believe that if we are able to continue in this particular direction, our object of making our Make in India program a little more successful and achieving higher growth rates in that segment also would be possible. I do believe that notwithstanding the slowdown globally, we would stand out as a brighter spot as far as the global economy is concerned.
Let me put to you, I'm getting some questions coming in, and I'll find out how many of you really would like to ask questions in the next 35 minutes. I detect a lot of impatience, though, Minister. Life tends to expect delivery pretty quickly. You're into a 5-year period and probably a 10-year period. And a lot in business respect and can see enormous changes you've made. But they're saying we're still not seeing enough at the speed we would expect. Do you accept that this is a legitimate concern? After all, perception is everything.
Well, I welcome criticism. I welcome even a certain amount of restlessness. In fact, a certain amount of restlessness in a country like India is a good sign. And I've always been giving the illustration of our recent first quarter result. None of us was very happy when we realized that we were only growing by 7%. If that's the measure of an aspirational India, therefore pressures on governments, including ours, is quite a legitimate thing. I think the government has moved fairly rapidly. The government's direction is absolutely clear. But for people to keep putting the pressure on us to move even more rapidly, I think is a legitimate concern.
Well, let me not put pressure on you, but ask a question about 4 particular issues of shifting labor law, of easing the labor laws, of tax reform, of power supply, and also land reform as well, which are seen all as obstacles to those who want to invest, whether domestic Indian businesses or foreign business as well. 4 critical areas: labor, tax, power supply, and land reform.
Let me deal with each one of these. Just remind me if I miss out any one of them. As far as tax is concerned, I made a reference in the opening comments that we had a lot of difficulties with our tax system. On the direct tax front, investors globally felt that the Indian system was a bit too aggressive, and therefore the stability and the consistency which is expected out of a tax regime wasn't there. The last government, if you recollect, had committed a major mistake in even enacting a tax retrospectively, and that actually spoiled the investment environment.
But can I just check, do you reckon that really has come to an end? Because there are those who talk about tax terrorism being back. And I've heard you in Davos, in San Francisco, in London, saying that's all over. The trouble is tax offices seem to have a different view of what the tax is.
I think that's being overstated, because the entire emphasis on a taxation system in India has now completely changed. The government announced that we won't have a retrospective tax system. We've lived up to our word. There were several legacy issues which we had of a very aggressive taxation attitude. One by one, we've been putting each one of them to sleep. Some, we are rectifying them through the judicial process, some by executive decision of the government. Only about 2 or 3 issues are left. Over the next couple of months, I'm reasonably certain that they'll be also resolved out. Our taxation rates, I went to the extent of announcing in the last budget that with effects from the coming year, India's corporate tax would come down to 25%, and we stand by our word. The process of rationalizing that system is going to begin. On an indirect tax regime, we almost have a tax at every point when a commodity enters one state to another or one city to another. Now, instead of that, a single point taxation in terms of the GST, the lower house has cleared it. It's in some political difficulty with the upper house. We intend to hope to clear it.
By April of next year, you hope still?
Well, that depends on, it's a constitution amendment which requires a 2/3 approval. The numbers are on our side. The principal party in the opposition has held up the upper house, and that's why it couldn't be passed, but that can't be an indefinite process. I'm reasonably optimistic that we should be able to arrive at some consensus as far as that is concerned. You asked about the labor laws.
Indeed.
Now, the labor law issue in the Indian context has always been overstated. In fact, several changes to the labor laws by our government have been brought about. Several changes are being brought about by the state governments, because labor itself is a concurrent subject which both governments can rectify it. The central government has approved the proposals of the state government. So an area which nobody had traditionally touched till today, there's a process of change and reform in that which had been started. As far as land is concerned, there was a 2013 land law which the previous government had brought about, which has certain processes in it which could be extremely time-consuming and challenging. Now, we had announced after a consensus of all the chief ministers that we'll bring certain amendments to that law. We introduced those amendments. Those amendments ran into a parliamentary challenge because the same parties whose chief ministers had asked for a change now switched their stands and said, we are going to oppose this law. The chief ministers of those states which are willing to change the law have come back and said, well, it's a concurrent list subject. Instead of having it stalemated in parliament, give us the option of the states amending their laws, and the central government must grant a proposal, an approval to the same. We've agreed to it. In fact, the first state, that's the state of Tamil Nadu, has already amended its laws, sought a central clearance, and started implementing it. So there is no stalemate as far as the land laws are concerned. These are now in the process of being approved through an alternative mechanism which we have found out, and which we have now put it on track. So the real objective seems to be that each of these areas must move on. And these areas, either by the central legislation or by supporting state legislations, continue to move on.
Power supply.
Well, power supply...
Because you announced the big solar investment by 2022.
Yes. Power supply situation in India, in fact, in terms of quantum of power, we are much better off than ever we have. In fact, last year, the problem for India was not inadequacy of power, but was surplus power. And surplus power which the regions and the states were not even able to pick up because the distribution companies had some financial challenges. Now, that is a major issue in India. We've taken up the financial health of the distribution companies, even though it's a state subject. We don't want it to be a burden on India's banking system. And it's only last week at the level of the Prime Minister, a meeting has been held, and to the 4 and 4, that's 8 states in all, where the distribution companies are a little stressed, some form of a settlement with them is being arrived at, that they'll have to reform themselves, they'll have to slowly charging their consumer the market rates so that they can come back to health. India's power problem is no longer inadequacy of power. It is surplus power which some of the state companies are not able to pick up. As far as the solar issue you mentioned, India's power was essentially dependent on fossil fuel coal. 70% of our power came from coal. We have 200 years of coal reserves. Now, as a part of the global effort for a cleaner environment, we have planned one of the largest renewable energy programs anywhere in the world. It's solar, it is wind, it is hydel. And that's a process which we have now started. In fact, that's one area where we are attracting and inviting investment in a much bigger manner. So as far as power sector in terms of power supply and alternate power is concerned, we seem to be on a comfortable track.
Land reform, still concerns about that, the length of time it takes to get the deeds and the access to land, given the great challenge of needing to develop. Still that sense that this is a big problem.
Let's first of all be very clear. How much land do we need? Now, economists have calculated that if India is to evolve into a developed society, the total amount of land which we require is about 1% of what is currently the agricultural land. So it's a very small part of it which is required. Now, this can be done by a central legislation. This can alternatively be done by a state legislation. So the net point that I made to you was that if the central legislation for political reasons runs into difficulties at New Delhi, the alternate route of the state legislation, which the chief ministers themselves have now proposed, at least the willing chief ministers have then proposed. We've accepted that suggestion, and that's a process which is currently on.
Let me talk about infrastructure. There's a question here about whether you've got the right framework for developing infrastructure, even if you're committing the money. There's one question here, no name attached to it. Many of the banks in India have large exposure to infrastructure project loans where delays have brought potential losses. Will the government consider changing the terms of some of these projects, for example in the power sector, to make them economically viable and profitable?
Well, I'll tell you, the challenges of different segments of infrastructure are entirely different in India. For instance, an important segment was the National Highway Building Program. The National Highway Building Program, which started off very successfully, slowed down in between during the last government. And one of the reasons was the solvency of those who construct highways. And those projects had come to a standstill. As I mentioned in the opening comment, we've been able to use a very large part of the resource which we've saved because of falling oil prices and diverted it into infrastructure construction. So the highways have restarted, and they've restarted quite well. In fact, a large number of contracts have been issued, they're being executed, and India's highway program is back on track. Rural roads doing reasonably well. As I speak to you in the 5th month of our financial year, almost 50 to 60% of the money meant for this year has been spent in the rural roads itself.
But what about these potential losses?
No, I'll tell you, railways. Railways has a large capacity for infrastructural spending. We've now opened up railway infrastructure for foreign direct investment. Reconstruction and redevelopment of railway stations is now being advertised, and the private parties are being invited to invest in it. As far as the operations of the railways is concerned, where railways needs a lot of funds, not only from the budget have I been able to allot the largest fund ever to the railways in history, they've been raising money through tax-free bonds. We've also got India's largest life insurance company to loan them a huge 30-year loan. So railways has a lot of funds now at its disposal for really establishing itself as a world-class railways. I only hope the railways is able to spend all that money, because that's also going to boost up the economy in a big way. The power sector problems of the infrastructure is not really a financial problem itself. Power sector private companies had overstressed themselves in these projects. And at the moment when there was an economic slowdown, power was not being lifted enough by the state discoms. Once we are able to resolve that issue, I'm quite certain the problems of the power sector discoms itself would also, power sector private companies would also resolve from this.
But for those here who are very interested in deepening their investment in India or moving into India, let me just quote, picking up on infrastructure, it's actually on the World Bank website after a World Bank meeting about this, where Rajiv Lal, the managing director and the vice chairman of the Infrastructure Development Finance Corporation, talks about the harsh reality of getting into trouble, all kinds of disputes and all of that he talks about. In other words, the soft skills are not enough now. We've got to lick our wounds and leap forward. And what he's saying is that actually the government needs to do the spending, but the work being done by private contractors for the moment, because at the moment the legal framework for the infrastructure developments is simply too costly and too risky for those that he's representing.
Well, I quite accept Rajiv's suggestion that the government will have to lead in spending, and that's precisely what the government is doing today. Having realized that the private investment in infrastructure is a little slow, the government has stepped up a lot of public investment. In fact, this year, the first 5 months, the public investment in infrastructure has gone up as high as 39% compared to the last year. And therefore, our investment really has gone up. One of the issues in the infrastructure projects has also been resolution of pending disputes. Now, this has a two-phase approach to resolve it. The first, obviously, being that whichever are projects held up for want of some permission, is the Prime Minister's office which monitors those today. And we've had quite a disposal in a large number of big projects which were stalled, which have now been kick-started once again. Resolution of legal disputes, we need a proper machinery. And that machinery through the process of Indian courts, etc., is very, very time consuming. Therefore, we have two-fold approach as far as that is concerned. We've amended our arbitration law and put the amendments in Parliament. Hopefully very soon they should be approved. The new arbitration law provides a 6-month time frame with no provision for extension for resolution of all arbitration disputes. There's a fast-track method which has been proposed. The second legal mechanism which we are proposing is, as far as large government contracts are concerned, instead of going through the entire judicial process, if they could be resolved by a dispute resolution authority, a statutory authority to be created under law, that's a bill which we are now going to introduce. It's at the final stages of its drafting.
I'll take any more questions on infrastructure and so on in a moment, but there's several other areas I'd like to ask the Minister about, and also ask how many other people would like to come in, even using a microphone at any stage in the next 20 minutes. I can't see any hands going up, but I'll come back to you in a moment. Think about it, please. Or do send me any questions here if you don't want to be on the record. Can I see a hand going up anywhere at the moment? No, I can't. Minister, jobs, work, employment. The demographics in your country are pretty formidable. Nothing's changing. It's getting, if anything, more challenging, particularly the next generation, the 15 to 24-year-olds. And there are several questions here about how you envisage the next generation, those who are born at the just being born now, and those who are 15 in their late teens, where they're going to get work. I mean, I was struck by something which was on one website today, 2.3 million applications for 368 government jobs in Uttar Pradesh. That's 6,250 applications for each job, including for 152,000 graduates. Now, this indicates the scale of the challenge that you and the Prime Minister now face. How do you face it, and where do you see this developing over the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, I am quite clear about the fact that this example you came has surfaced in the last 3-4 days. It's a correct set of facts. And therefore, to expect only government to create jobs by oversizing itself, just not possible. The government structures, if at all, are becoming smaller than what they were. They'll probably have to. To expect only large industry to create jobs, probably some jobs are possible, and this entire workforce can't be absorbed. I think in order to absorb this workforce, there is a twofold strategy that has now evolved over the years. The first is that we need to skill a large number of our new generation into various forms of vocation. And there's a huge skill development program which the government has undertaken. There's a ministry at the central government level, there are corresponding supports at the state government level, and 20 different departments of the world are skilling people in 78 different vocations. Secondly, our experience has been that we need to support these people in a big way, even in the unorganized sector, to become smaller entrepreneurs themselves. Those are the segments which create jobs. As a matter of statistic, if I have to tell you, large industry in India has created 20 million jobs. The unorganized sector and the small sector has created 110 million jobs.
Would you still call them jobs, though, Minister? Is it work? Is it... The phrase now being used is the gig economy. In other words, people are finding ways of earning money, but it may not be a job anymore. Can you see that happening in India much
these
more?
people are not merely finding ways of earning money, they are creating 1 or 2 additional jobs, even as self-employed people. And we've therefore undertaken a massive campaign on behalf of the government. We call it the Mudra campaign. It's a Mudra agency which we have created, which is supported by the Indian banking system, which is now funding this unfunded segment of the Indian society so that this can contribute in a large manner, first by self-employment, by self-enterprises. So there are shopkeepers, there are hawkers, there are workmen, there are drivers, there are plumbers, there are electricians. Now these are all people generating jobs for themselves, probably creating some other jobs also. So in addition to the organized sector of job creation, which is government, large industry, services sector, manufacturing, these are the other sectors which we need to encourage in a big way. And when you speak in terms of employment, there is a very large underemployment in India's agriculture sector. Therefore, over the next few decades, we need to take out a very large percentage of people out of that agricultural sector.
and therefore into manufacturing and other sectors of Indian society.
Many of them want to move to cities anyway.
Move to cities, they probably would move to cities anyway. And therefore, rather than move to cities and create slums, you have to have an organized creation of suburban townships, newer smart cities. And that's why our government has taken up this big challenge of creating 100 smart cities in the country itself.
And you've got 600,000 villages. There's a question here building on that, Minister. Peter Franken from Monex Securities in Japan. With all the automation, robotics, and breakthrough in AI, artificial intelligence, and biotech, longer lives, building on this question, how do you see our children will be engaged in 20 to 30 years from now, while more and more people have longer lives to enjoy? Is there a risk not much to do to keep our young and old engaged? And indeed, Vincent Chin of Boston Consulting had asked about the enormous demographic challenges in your country.
Well, I think I've partly referred to an answer to this question in the previous comment that I had made. Because the changing dimension of economic activity in Indian society will have to be now a lot more outside agriculture. We'll have to expand our manufacturing sector. Our services sector grows very fast. People will move around new engines of growth, which will be also around big cities, middle-level cities, and then people will have to be self-employed. And for that self-employment purposes, this segment will have to be funded and funded at state initiative, which is also our banking system.
I can take many more questions if you want. We've got about 15 or 20 minutes. Do I see any hands going up yet? Please, are you all sitting on your hands? Okay, well, I will keep asking you. I don't want anyone to say you didn't ask my question. But picking up on what I mentioned earlier about the perceptions, Edward Kieswetter from South Africa, what's your view, Minister, the biggest reason for low private sector investment and low confidence? In other words,
I don't think there is a loss of confidence as far as private sector is concerned. India's entrepreneurial skills...
That's his perception, though.
Well, India's entrepreneurial skills are very competent, and therefore India's private sector has had a very important role, particularly after 1991 when India's private sector was given a level playing field. And with each passing year, that confidence, that investment has been increasing. The problem has been that with global slowdown, India's private sector had also overstressed itself, built excess capacities. Now they are trying to subsume those excess capacities, and therefore they are involved in that process. But at the same time, there are a large number of newer Indian enterprises which are coming up. There are startups coming up, there are technology-based companies which are coming up, there are private sector companies which are re-employing their resources into newer areas. It's not that the private sector is sitting still and not being able to do enough. At a time where the economy was slow, the private sector was feeling stressed, the government had to step in, and therefore India's larger investment in the last 1 year has been public investment and foreign direct investment. But the private sector companies are also trying to do their best in India. We couldn't have grown 7.5% without the participation of the private sector.
There are some very specific and detailed questions here, neither of them with a name, but I'm going to give them to you anyway. We welcome the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India's recent move to establish an offshore rupee-linked framework, but withholding tax at 20% is still prohibitive. Will you lower the withholding tax to 5% to equalize it with other ECBs?
Well, you see, everybody wants either not to pay tax or to lower the taxes. But at the same time, every year I have to reassess, every finance minister has to reassess the taxes depending on the needs of the state and his own
You're
capacities.
not alone in that.
I don't think I have too much deep pockets at the moment.
You do have a dividend from oil, though, at the moment, don't you?
No,
from the subsidies you're not paying.
You see, we have some advantage of the lower oil prices, but that I am now utilizing entirely in increasing public investment. Because at a time when you yourself mentioned that private investment is little slow, it's there but a little slow, I need to increase public investment. So whatever I am able to save from oil, commodities and other things, I am able to divert for this extra public investment. As I again say at the cost of repetition, we couldn't have grown at 7.5% without that necessary public investment being put into the system.
India's growing economy still has a huge insurance protection gap. Yet the government's taxes stifles insurance capacity by discriminating against overseas reinsurers. Your thoughts, Minister?
Well, I don't think the awareness and access to insurance in India was a big problem. And therefore, rules of insurance are being increasingly liberalized in India. And therefore, as we liberalize in terms of the foreign direct investment. And of course, if people have issues with regard to reinsurance regulations, they're welcome to get in touch with me or my office, and we'll certainly look into them. But let me give you...
What will you say to them?
Well, I'm certainly willing to look at them. If they have a difficulty with certain issues, we are certainly willing to look at them. But by using this insurance as an example, we've been trying to create awareness in India about the need to have an insured society. India was substantially an uninsured society. And though not connected with this question, let me use this opportunity to give you one interesting fact. One of the important social security programs we've started in India is that every poor man must try and get an insurance against an accident or on life. So we've started in the last few months a new set of social security insurances for the weaker sections of society. And that awareness has been so successful that in a matter of a few weeks, we've been able to get 120 million people under those two insurance schemes. And that's an unprecedented awareness in India, which has come in a society which historically remained an uninsured society till today.
Looking externally, what role will India play in the new multipolar world? For example, on geopolitical stability, that from Gurdaily from Accenture.
Well, as far as India's role is concerned, India is in the mainstream of countries trying to play a role for geopolitical stability. We believe that the world must be freed of all tensions. We've historically had a very positive role. We are conscious of the fact that we've learned these lessons because of our own strategic location. We exactly haven't enjoyed the best neighborhood ourselves. And therefore, a large part of our economic resource has been subsumed because of the tensions which existed around India. And therefore, nobody is better aware of the cost of global tensions than we are.
Let me ask you a pretty technical question, but it's actually intriguing given what we're looking at in China over the rate of growth and so on. The rate of inflation in India, because there's been a fascinating, or is a fascinating ongoing discussion, including with your chief economic advisor, Arvind Subramanian, who's here, about wholesale price index and the consumer price index, and the fact that there's an 8% difference between them. Now, one is in negative, the wholesale price index, and the consumer price index is 3.66%. Now, this is fascinating because it raises interesting questions about inflation and deflation. Now, it's very technical, but in many ways, it helps us judge the way that the Indian economy is really going. Is it based on the wholesale price index or the consumer price index? What's your view as minister?
Well, Arvind has been making this point very clear in his own capacity and on behalf of the government. I have no view very different from him. But then the factors which influence the two indexes are somewhat slightly different. And therefore, there has been some inflation in recent days on account of some food items, etc., which would be more reflected in the consumer price index itself. However, there are several items whose prices globally have gone down. India has benefited from this, and therefore the wholesale price index remains at a negative week after week in India.
So which figure do we believe? I mean, as he says, there's a diverging wedge which is not completely understood.
Well, it's for economists like Arvind to analyze them and explain it to us. But divergence between the wholesale price index and consumer price index is not for the first time that it's appeared. The wedge is a bit too large this time. That's the only difference that it has made.
The trouble is, of course, for you and your government, this is the way you're going to be judged. Is it negative or positive? And outside
well, by Indian standards, when we took over, when we entered the government, just a few days before that, India was almost suffering from a double-digit inflation. And therefore, if inflation comes down to 3% on consumer price index and minus 4% on wholesale price index, I think we broadly consider inflation to be under control.
Right, we've got 5 minutes to go. Does anyone want to come in? Do I see a hand going up? Yes, please. And I'm sorry I can't see you. Let's get a microphone there. And I can take 2 or 3 comments if you'd like. I've got 1 or 2 more here, but please, 1 microphone there. Would anyone else like to come in?
Minister, thank you for your comments. My name is John Rice from GE. First, with respect to the foreign direct investment, as you know, our company is very interested in a number of projects, and the rail modernization is one. So I'm very encouraged by your comments that it will move forward quickly. But my comment is with respect to U.S. policy, and specifically decisions being made in the United States not to support the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and to let EXIM reauthorization lapse. Do you and your colleagues see this as an opportunity for India to play a more significant role with respect to export credit financing and global trade?
Well, we certainly do see it as an opportunity, but then we do believe that Asian Infrastructure Development Bank and similar institutions of this kind, the BRICS Bank, for instance, they've come up over the last few years depending on the needs of the region. Also, there has been this increasing effort with regard to other international institutions to be reformed. The slow pace of reforms has actually encouraged the formation of some of these other institutions itself. And therefore, I see no inconsistency with the different funding agencies of this kind then coming up.
Anyone else want to come in? Minister, can you see any hands going up? Because I can't. Let me put to you again, before I spoke to you, I was talking to several people both here and also before I left Europe about the perception here of the speed and depth of transformation that you and the Prime Minister and your government are determined to achieve. Let's be fair, probably not just in 5 years, but in 10 years, given the political realities in your country. But there is this sense that you're making a lot of small improvements, but this really isn't a series of transformations which are going to be of a significant, irreversible type. I'm quoting others here.
I think if you were to play to the devil's advocate, you can put that question. But if you
I'm reflecting what people have said to me.
But let me tell you, if you look at the entire segment of reforms that we've embarked on, if you take each one of them collectively, now dismantling an organization which had totally centralized planning in India and replacing it by an enabling organization is a major reform. Transforming the Indian state's finances and therefore the Indian regions, which were always starved of funds, to make them surplus with funds by transforming the devolution structures in India. The recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission is an extremely important reform which we've made. Opening out sectors which earlier were never perceived to be possible to open out, the railways, defense, etc. It's a very major reform. Taxation-wise, if I am able to get through with the GST, it will probably be the most significant taxation reform since independence. Bringing down direct taxes down in a high-tax economy like India to 25%. If that's the kind of targets which we have in mind, opening out natural resources of India, which were only given as government largesse and on discretions by a fair market-driven mechanism where no questions are raised, funding regions which are never funded because the proceeds of some of these minerals and coal go to those tribal areas which are coal-bearing, which are mineral-bearing. And these have become some of the most progressive states in India. This is an extremely important reform. In fact, 3-4 days ago, when the World Bank came with a ranking of Indian states, I mentioned it this morning and I'm repeating it. In the first 6 positions were 3 of India's most important tribal regions, Orissa, Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. Now, these are states which have now eased because of the resources we've created in favor of those states. Now, these are very significant, long-lasting reforms. Now, without a series of these reforms, we couldn't have become one of the world's fastest-growing economies without having undertaken these significant steps.
But do you fear that, or do you and the Prime Minister and those around you and him consider that if you don't make the significant seismic progress that is needed, that given the 5-year cycle in politics, there will be frustration, irritation, impatience, which could mean that probably your assumption that in 3.5 years... I was about to mention what happened in Delhi earlier this year, where what was thought to be a shoo-in for the BJP did not work out in any way like that.
Well, I think elections are a process. You can win 7 and you can lose the 8th one. Now, that doesn't mean that the trend is against you. There's an election next month. Again,
but they send messages.
No, it does. It does. Of course, nobody likes to lose an election, but we've, in the last 1.25 years, we've won most of the regional elections which have taken place. But let me tell you, at the same time, there was a study just came out yesterday from the United States, how people are broadly satisfied with the Prime Minister's management of the country and the economy itself. Therefore, there is a large support for it. We find that there is absolutely no resistance as far as reforms are concerned. The only resistance comes from a small section in Parliament, if at all. Not outside Parliament. There haven't been any public protests or obstructions against the government's reform program. In fact, a country with a 400 million strong middle class strongly backs those reforms because the net impact of all this is higher growth, which is the best response possible to poverty. Even to get people lifted out of the levels of poverty, you need larger economic activity, you need more economic resources with the government so that we are able to transfer these resources to those poor people.
Right. I'm told we've got a little more time, Minister, providing you're happy to keep going. And more questions are coming in here, most of them anonymous, which explains why none of the hands are going up at the moment. So this is a great way of knowing what's on their mind. Intellectual property and respect for copyright. This from Rick, no surname. There is an increasing amount of movies and television programs going through internet delivered by smartphones, and some of those who deliver them are here. Entrepreneurs are starting to bring those ventures into India. Will the government try to protect existing free and pay TV sectors? Because India does have a tradition of being very protectionist about this.
Well, India's intellectual property regime is very much globally compatible. It's WTO compatible, it's globally compatible, and we have a large, because as a society which has a very large human resource and which has one of the largest cinema industries in the world, we also have a large interest in protecting copyright. And therefore, to say that India would not protect copyright is not possible. However,
but protect copyright for everyone, whether foreigners or Indians.
Obviously you can't. And if you've seen the evolution of copyright jurisprudence, or for that matter, any form of intellectual property right jurisprudence by Indian courts, some of the most progressive judgments globally have come from the Indian courts itself, which have been in the forefront of protecting IPR.
Now, an important question about Aadhaar, which for those who don't know is this wonderful new registration card scheme. I think 850 million have been registered so far, run by Mr. Nilekani. Let's talk about something happier, Minister, says this anonymous contributor. Aadhaar is enabling new public sector and private sector services. What lessons have you learned from the Aadhaar rollout? And what do you have in store for e-government? Because there was a moment when your Prime Minister was a little cool on the idea.
No, you see, there were several issues raised at one time with regard to the Aadhaar program itself. Now, one of the issues raised was that there was no legislative support to it, and that's why the courts had started interfering for want of legislative support. Once we came into government, we re-examined the whole issue, and we publicly announced, the Prime Minister and I both decided, that this is a program which we are going to support. This government, and we have accepted this whole concept in India, a phrase coined by my colleague here, the Chief Economic Advisor. We have one set of data on the Janadhan accounts. These are those financial inclusion accounts. Almost 180 million new bank accounts for poor people which we've opened up. Then we have the mobile telephony connections, which are now available to almost 900 million people in India. And then you have the Aadhaar platform. And that's why this entire platform taken together has given us a huge database. Now, the advantage of this database has been in many, many segments itself. Therefore, if it is transfer of any form of state support through this segment, it is possible. If it is identifying that schemes are not misused, it is possible. And therefore, the government has accepted this whole concept. And that's why when I was mentioning to you earlier that one of our subsidy rationalization programs, for example, in a split moment, we are able to transfer to 120 million people the benefits of the cooking gas subsidies which we give to the poor people. And in that process, we've been able to eliminate about 30% leakage. So the government has been able to save a lot of money. In other areas like food subsidies, in fertilizer subsidies, we are now moving forward by starting pilot programs as far as certain regions are concerned. If the pilot programs are successful, we'll then experiment in other areas. So this database has been of immense use as far as administration of public finances in India are concerned.
And where do you see it going, given the level of e-commerce, the e-potential, and the need to understand the way your population at every single level is thinking?
Well, it's a unique identity number. Currently, it is in challenge before the Supreme Court because issues of individual privacy, etc. are involved. And therefore, we'll have to wait till the Supreme Court decides. But we are finding ways of making sure that we are able to come out with that, out of that legal challenge and eventually implement it for the purposes of identification of each individual, and then use this as a support system in matters of governance.
Are you convinced by its security as well, that there will be no hacking, it won't be misused? Are you confident in the security level?
Well, I think that's for the technical experts really to decide. And I'm sure the technical experts are reasonably certain that this data misuse probably can be protected. The firewalls around this data are quite capable of being created.
Another technical question for you, Minister. The Sahu Committee recognized the importance of external financing to support the structural current account deficit. Where is India on implementing the recommendations to liberalize the ECB and FII frameworks?
Well, these are recommendations which we keep getting regularly, and therefore they are always in the process of consideration. Now, anytime a change is required, it has to undergo through a detailed consultation process within the government with stakeholders, and then finally the cabinet takes a decision on this. At the moment, this is probably under consideration. It hasn't come to my table at the moment, as yet.
Under consideration, is there some kind of timeline for this?
Well, it hasn't come to my table yet. I assure you that I'll certainly, since it has been brought to my notice by this question, I'll certainly look at it.
Anyone want to come in, please? Any of you sitting on your hands still? Please. Yes, at the back. Microphone there. I can take 2 or 3 more questions, so please don't hold back. Introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Honorable Minister, for your comments today. My name is Kunal Bahl. I run Snapdeal, a leading e-commerce company in India. The question I had was slightly a different track, which is if you had to make a list of 3 to 5 ideas that startup entrepreneurs in India should work on, what should those be to solve India's problems?
Well, I think the startup entrepreneurs know much better than me as to the areas they would start up on. Because startup entrepreneurs can look at education, startup entrepreneurs could look at any form of commercial transactions on e-commerce itself. Startup entrepreneurs can look at any forms of rural literacy. Startup entrepreneurs can look at any forms of trade distribution systems. Now, these are all areas, at least the startup entrepreneurs in conceiving and utilizing that technology certainly would be far ahead of what the governmental thinking on the subject is.
But they expect you to facilitate it, to provide the envelope which can make them flourish and feel confident.
Well, I think that's an important change which has taken place in India. From a regulatory mechanism, states' role as an enabler in terms of policy now is something which has come to be recognized.
Anyone else, please? I'm scanning the horizon. We've got 7 minutes to go before dessert will arrive. Let me ask you another couple of questions which will come through. First, a comment from Stefan Dobochki. I was always struck by how intensely the Indian leaders compared India with China. I heard Chinese leaders comparing China with India. Hardly did he hear Chinese leaders comparing China with India. And now here's his question. How do you feel that China's slowing down impacts India? An opportunity or a threat? And let me add to that. I was in China last week, and I think many people here have very close experience of China. Do you believe the numbers coming out of China at the moment, or is the slowdown actually much worse, probably, than the numbers suggest?
Well, I don't see any reason why I should be commenting on the Chinese numbers itself. But one thing is clear, that the Chinese normal in terms of its growth has now changed. It's no longer what it used to be for the last 3 decades. And the world has got to recognize the fact that Chinese leadership themselves are conceding. As an important economy, China has carried world growth on its shoulder for a number of years. I do hope they continue to prosper. But as far as the current situation is concerned, I don't think the adverse reports coming out of China with regard to the slowing down of the growth are going to in any way adversely impact on India. India is not a part of the Chinese production chain significantly. And the factors which have led to the Chinese slowdown are certainly not factors which are relevant to India. In fact, in the current global situation, the two segments, that's commodities, oils, which have been adversely affected, the world market, certainly don't adversely impact on India, India being a net importer. And therefore, we are, the more the low price regime continues, the more India continues to benefit from that situation.
Let me ask you about, we are 2.5 months away from the climate change conference, the COP21 in Paris. What position will India be taking in that? You are investing in this enormous solar panel array by 2022, but you're still buying an enormous amount of cheap coal at the same time. What kind of line is India going to take, do you believe?
Well, I can tell you what India's conventional line has been. Conventionally, India is not one of the countries which was responsible for creating the situation in the environment which had existed. Our own development levels were fairly low. So we still have a large number of people who need houses. We still have a long way to go as far as industries are concerned. We still need to provide even electricity to many homes in India. And therefore, there's a large amount of progress which we still have to make. And therefore, India's energy needs are going to increase. But as a responsible state, India is conscious of its responsibility to the environment itself. And therefore, India has chalked out probably the largest program in the world for renewable energy. Renewable in terms of solar, wind, hydel, and so on. And therefore, a part of India's strategy has been that the percentage of Indian energy requirement which is occupied by coal-based energy itself has to come down, and this alternative energy has to increase. India is one of the few countries in the world that we've imposed a clean energy tax. Therefore, for every sale of coal in India now is being taxed and taxed reasonably high. Twice we've imposed a tax on that as a disincentive on the use of coal itself. The entire benefit of the reduction of the oil prices, part of which we've diverted to infrastructure creation itself. And therefore, conscious of our responsibility on this, India has a very large program of renewable energy on its cards.
But you
and
use
therefore,
the word,
our stand at the Paris is going to be guided by all these considerations.
but you started your answer by talking about you used the word conventional. Surely conventional, even in a place like Australia, they're reconsidering.
Well,
there are many countries who are not being conventional about this.
I use the word conventional because to re-emphasize the point that India's energy needs are going to increase because we are still at a very low ebb as far as development is concerned. But at the same time, we are conscious of our responsibility as a large nation, and therefore we've undertaken this entire renewable energy program. And therefore these facts, I think, would determine the stand which our Ministry of Environment will finally formulate for the Paris Conclave.
I'm going to slightly amend or build on a question here, and you mentioned it earlier about the BRICS and the way things are moving, about the growing sense that BRICS is simply a romantic notion with no substantive impact. There is the new investment bank, mind you, and every country is simply acting in their own interest. What's your comment on that, as well as the AIIB? In other words, what is changing? Are you, as a minister, someone who's been looking at this for many, many years, seeing a shift in the Bretton Woods architecture now? Do you believe it is that seismic potentially?
Well, I think a set of countries with emerging economies with similar economic interests have got together. The concept was originally thrown up, and these are new economies which are growing up. And these economies took an initiative in certain financial infrastructure being created. And therefore, this financial infrastructure in no way is going to threaten any other existing large institution which has survived the test of time for years.
Won't threaten it at all, you don't
I don't
believe?
think so.
Because I do have one.
These are parallel institutions, not mutually destructive institutions.
Because I do have another anonymous question. Would the government of India support Raghu Rajan's candidature as Christine Lagarde's successor at the IMF?
Well, I don't know who's the candidate at the moment.
It's a question here. Anyone else want to ask a question? 2 minutes to run, and then we'll finish. Nothing more. Minister, I think you've given many answers which they were looking for, or with the questions that were on their minds. But I have a comment here from Arun, not a Jaitley, I have to say. Comment: congratulations to you and your government on the achievements, strategy, and most importantly, clarity in what you want to achieve and how. Keep going. Don't be disturbed by the negative questions.
I think the last question is something that you have to answer.
I'm merely reflecting what others have told me. My final question, Sunil Mittal from Bharti Enterprises, sitting in the front row, but he's now said, don't mention my name. So I'm sorry about that, Sunil. Where are you? I hadn't seen that bit. And I'm not sure if I should ask this question. He's asking about the Indian cricket team and what do you think of it, its performance so far.
Well, the Indian cricket team has undergone a very significant change. A lot of veterans have retired, and therefore a new cricket team is being built up. And this new cricket team has a lot of potential. It has a very strong leader in terms of the new captain that we've chosen, Virat Kohli, a very aggressive captain. And I think cricket is almost like nature, it abhors vacuum. So the moment Sachin Tendulkar and Rahul Dravid retire, there's a space created for new champions to be born. And I'm quite sure that the new team which is building up will take some time before it stabilizes, but it's doing reasonably well already.
Does the Prime Minister have a say in this?
Well, what makes you think that the Prime Minister interferes in everything?
I didn't say that. Right, no other questions. Thank you very much indeed, Minister, for sparing your time and taking so many questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.